Oh, hello. There certainly are an awful lot of ships coming to the big harbor this morning. You know, even though it's winter, and I can't always see out my frosty window. My special radio here, that's my eye on the harbor. Roger. Out. You know, I can hear all the ships coming in over this radio. They call me just before they arrive, so I can tell the dispatcher to send the pilot boats and the tugs out to meet them. It's like a big team, everybody working together, and no one part of the team is any more important than the others. Take my radio here now. Now, what would happen if one part thought that it was more important than the rest? What do you think? You'd have a disaster. You know, the tugboats almost had a disaster not too long ago. They had a very big job to do all by themselves, and they forgot about teamwork. Whoa, what an incredible adventure that was. And you know, it happened on a winter's morning, just as fair and as frosty as this one. The first fingers of sunlight fell upon the sleeping tugs and tickled them awake. They opened their eyes and saw a most surprising sight. What is it? Said Hank finally. It's ice, said Theodore, who couldn't believe his eyes either. Overnight, big chunks of ice from the cold North Seas had drifted into the big harbor, pushed by the strong winter wind. Everything looked so different. Looks like the moon, whispered George. Or a valley of jewels, breathed Emily. The dispatcher was just as surprised as the tugs. See, the last time there'd been ice in the big harbor was over 100 years ago, but the biggest surprise was still to come. Tugboats, announced the dispatcher in his most serious voice. As you know, it is our solemn and ancient pledge to keep the big harbor open. Through wind, or rain, or snow, or ice. But today the pilot boats cannot go out into the ice. Now their hulls are too thin, so the harbor might have to be closed. Closed? The tugboats knew that would be dangerous for the ships out on the freezing ocean, who wouldn't be able to come into a safe, warm dock. Well, I decided that the tugboats must take charge. Now, their hulls were strong and stout, and their hearts were brave. It was the dispatcher's job to give them the news. Tugboats, he announced, today the pride of the big harbor depends on you. The dispatcher read off the day's work to be done, and the tugs listened quietly. But mostly they were thinking about pledges and pride and other important-sounding words. When the dispatcher had finished, the tugs turned and floated silently out into the harbor. Hooray! Shouted Theodore. We're in charge, said George. No pilots, tooted Theodore. The tugboat set to work. Emily and George went to move Bobby Barge. I should be in front, said Emily, because I can steer better around the ice. Well, said George, as if he were really thinking about Emily's idea. Then he said, no, I think I better be in charge of steering. Well, George went crashing right through the ice. Theodore brought Bonavista Barge to the salvage yards with a load of scrap metal. Oh, it was tough tugging. Sometimes the ice came all the way up the Bonavista's bumpers. The ice was so thick that Philip and Fillmore, the ferry twins, couldn't get across the harbor. So Theodore and Hank were sent to pull them. By the time they had made their final trip with the ferries, it was almost nighttime, and the two tugs realized they hadn't explored the ice at all. The ice seemed to be winking all around them in the winter twilight. Let's go out again, Theodore, said Hank. Do you think we're allowed? Wondered Theodore. We're in charge, said Hank. Okay, shouted the tugs, feeling the tickly ice under their hulls. Meanwhile, the other tugboats were just finishing their work for the day. They had taken charge and kept the harbor open. They were very tired and looking forward to their nice warm dock. But little did they know that the biggest adventure of all was just about to begin. I know you are tired, announced the dispatcher. But a big oil tanker named Olympia has just arrived and we must get her into the harbor tonight. Do you think you can do it? Sure, said George. You can count on us, Mr. Dispatcher. But, said Emily, where are Theodore and Hank? The tugs couldn't wait for Theodore and Hank. Off they went to meet the oil tanker. The great ship was really a sight to see, floating there in the middle of all that ice. happened onto the tanker and began bringing her into the harbor, bound for the docks at the oil refinery on the shore of the harbor. George went crashing through the ice again. His big twin engines went vroom, vroom, vroom. It was just about then that Vodac's radio crackled out a warning from the dispatcher. A giant icebreaker named Inverness was arriving in the harbor to clear ice. All the ships and boats were to return to their docks as soon as possible. "We'd better hurry," called Emily. Vodak decided he better take charge and direct the tanker into port. "I'm in charge," snorted George. But Vodak, who had always wanted to be a pilot boat, gave directions to George in a commanding voice just like Pearl. "Come over here now, George. Full ahead." George tried to turn, but with all the thick ice around him, he couldn't. So he plowed on ahead right into the middle of a heavy ice floe. "It's a good thing I'm up front," he thought, and vroomed his engines even more. Our friends Theodore and Hank were busy in the ice too. Theodore was pretending he was an icebreaker ship. He went plowing through the thick ice, breaking it with the weight of his hull. Hank was pushing the ice, pretending the piles were giant ships he was moving around the harbor. "Look at me," he shouted, feeling very strong and powerful. Meanwhile, George was still vrooming away. The ice seemed to be getting thicker and thicker, and he was feeling very hot, as if he had a fever. Said Emily to herself. "Those clouds are very low." And then she saw the clouds were really smoke pouring from George's engines. "George, turn off your engines," he shouted. "They're getting too hot," called Vodak. George had to stop pulling right away, or else his engines might have been seriously damaged. He slowed down, almost to a stop. And that was a good thing, because Theodore and Hank were so busy moving ice around, they had not been paying attention to where they were going. They were heading straight for the ship. Theodore and Hank were very surprised to see the other tugs. "Well, what are you doing here?" they said. "Working. And you should have been helping us," said George. "Well, you should have gone where I told you," said Vodak to George. "Well, you should have let me be in front," said Emily. The tugs all began to quarrel about who should have done what and what should have been done when, and then they heard a deep, deep horn. It was coming from far out on the ocean, but it made all the tugs shiver because they knew what it meant. The giant icebreaker was coming and they had to get out of her way, and they were still a long way from the dock at the oil refinery. "It's all my fault," said George sadly. "I wanted to be in charge, but I guess I didn't do what I was supposed to do." "Me too," added Vodak. "And me," said Theodore. And then Emily agreed. "Oh," said Hank finally, "and also me." Just then, they heard the icebreaker's horn again. And she sounded closer. "The pilot boats would know what to do," said Hank in a very small voice. "Hank's right," said Emily, thinking, "Petra always says many tugs make light work. We should all work together." "You're right, Emily," said Theodore. "You're the best steerer, so you go in front. George should push because he's the strongest, and Hank and I can help by pushing on the side." And so the brave tugboats set out to move the great ship through the dark and icy harbor. There was Emily the vigorous, pulling in front, steering the tanker between the ice jams, and Theodore and Hank at the side, keeping her nice and steady as she went. And valiant George, who pushed and pushed on with all his might. And Vodak the Vigilant leading the way, using his firefighting light to shine a safe path for his friends. Finally, the tugs saw the friendly lights of the big harbor just ahead. They were almost there. Soon, they reached the oil refinery. But docking that tanker proved to be the hardest job those tired tugs had ever faced. For the harder they pushed, the tighter the ice packed in between the tanker and the dock, until they couldn't budge her another inch no matter how they tried. Then they heard the icebreaker's deep horn again, but much closer now. No one was thinking about pride or solemn pledges anymore. Instead, each tugboat was thinking they'd let the harbor down. All eyes turned to Theodore. If anyone could think of a plan, it was Theodore. Good old Theodore. The tugs held their breath. Theodore cleared his throat and said, "Hank and I were pushing ice around." Well, the tugs let out their breath in a long, slow, sad gasp like air leaking from a balloon. Theodore had just been daydreaming. It was certain now. All was lost. "Wait!" shouted Theodore. The tugs turned again to Theodore. If Hank and I were pushing the ice around the harbor, why couldn't we all push it away here? That way we could dock the tanker. Well, that's exactly what they did. Theodore and Hank cleared away the ice. George and Emily pushed and pushed. And Photo stayed close by and directed everyone. With all the tugs working together, the oil tanker was safely in her dock just as the icebreakers sounded her warning to clear the harbor. They had done it. The tugs all tooted their horns with pride. And even though they were very, very tired, they were very, very excited and couldn't wait to tell all the other ships and boats in the harbor about their great adventure, just as soon as they were back at their dock. Or maybe it might have to wait until the very next day. Well, everyone sure was proud of those tugboats. They worked together and they kept the harbor open. And the very next day, the pilot boats were able to go back to work. They sure were surprised by that